Hello and welcome to The Hub on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Gloomy and more uncertain. That is the IMF's forecast for 2022 and 2023 in its World Economy Update announced on Tuesday. Not so long ago, it looked as though global growth was recovering from a long pandemic. But now, estimates have been cut by nearly half to 3.2%. In addition, things could get even worse if some doomsday scenarios come true, such as Russia cutting off gas supplies to Europe. What are the key challenges or even dangers likely to throw a spanner in the works and potentially sink the world economy? And could China be a global driver once again? For more on this, I'm joined in Beijing via video link by Joerg Wuttke, president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China, and also by Andy Mok, senior research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. And with me here in the Beijing studio by Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, gentlemen. We saw this forecast. It's not the first time that we've encountered this, the IMF downgrading the global economic forecast. First of all, I want to get your takeaway from this report. Professor Liu, let me start with you. What's your biggest takeaway from this report?
Well, economists begin to complain the credibility of such sort of report. As a matter of fact, it is really the credibility of the reality that is there to provide a lot of vitality and at the same time a lot more uncertainty that really provoked such sort of reports from major international institutions to change in a dramatic manner, from 6.1 to 3.2. That's a big difference, but it is really the global developments that create such a reality that that is there to boost the revision of such a sort of forecast. So all in all, we do not really see a very bright prospect, and also the expectation that for economic recovery, however slow it might be, will not really be within easy reach. So therefore, it's really up to a number of uncertainties that can really change the whole globe, like the pandemic control, like the Ukraine conflict, and many other issues, particularly global commodity prices, etc. So the world have to manage the uncertainty, and whether those risks are controllable is really not upon individual government, but also it's really the collective efforts of the global community to address such sort of issues.
Yeah, so many risks and external shocks out there. Talking about risks, President Wuttke, we're living in an age where geopolitics oftentimes, if not always, dictate economic behaviors on many occasions. The IMF report highlighted the risks of the war in Ukraine, among other things. What worries you the most from this IMF report?
Well, as a matter of fact, last month, the European Chamber launched a report, our survey, and you can see from the cover that basically we're talking about black swan events. The good news you can also see on the cover, it has a lighthouse, so it's not all doom and gloom. If the world actually talks to each other, meets together, talks about reforms and maintaining borders open, actually, I think we can sort of maneuver through it. But of course, the two black swans has been the Russian attack on Ukraine, or of course, the recurrence of COVID in China, as China has been stabilizing the global economy. I think it's all down to how we manage it as companies. But of course, I totally agree with my friend Baocheng. It's going to be a far more difficult ride through the year 2022-2023.
I mean, Andy, is there a silver lining in all this, or is it just all gloomy and uncertain from this IMF report?
Well, I think that, first of all, there is a silver lining. But before I get to that, I do want to add a little bit to things that we should worry about. Recession certainly is on the table for some countries, but I think even more worrying is a potential sovereign debt crisis in the United States. And we know that debt crises play out over decades and not years. And it was really only 10 years ago when S&P Global ratings downgraded the United States and it lost its AAA rating. And looking ahead, there's really cause for concern from a financial perspective. U.S. government debt has exceeded $30 trillion. We just saw a 75 basis point interest rate increase with more on the horizon that could hammer equity prices. But perhaps more worryingly, from a political perspective, the midterm elections in the United States are coming up in November. If the Republicans seize control of the House, impeachment proceedings against President Biden seem inevitable. We may see a return to this debt ceiling brinksmanship, which could spark further turmoil in financial markets, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And then looking at, as Joerg mentioned, the challenges in Ukraine.
But Andy, very quickly, an impeachment potentially of Joe Biden over what allegations if the GOP's regain control of the House?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of, I guess, ideas, some would say conspiracies floating around. I think that the specifics we have to see, but the polarization certainly isn't in doubt. And we see members in the U.S. Congress that are promoting this idea that Biden is not a legitimately elected president. So who knows? I mean, there's just so much uncertainty. But also, I just want to say here that the Ukraine conflict has resulted in a big problem for holders of U.S. debt, in that the grand bargain or the foundational agreement for trade around the world, especially with the U.S. and China, is that China buys U.S. government securities with the expectation that the U.S. will remain a credible partner. And what we've seen is the weaponization of the financial system, which is causing a lot of concern, not just for China, but Japan, other countries that hold U.S. government securities. So I think if we want to think about black swans, or I would even call this a gray rhino, because we all know this exists. The question is not if, but when. Now, Wang Guan, to your point about a silver lining, here's the silver lining that I see. COVID has really impacted the world and China in some very negative ways. But what we've seen in China is a tremendous resilience and adaptation that has caused short-term economic pain and social pain as well. But I think it positions China at the forefront of dealing with future challenges like this. And the public health people that I've spoken to, I'm sure you've spoken to as well, say that this COVID pandemic will not be the last. We will experience other types of challenges like this. And I think we've developed the infrastructure that is more resilient. So we may see a decrease in old school globalization, but I think integration of China with the rest of the world will continue under these new, more resilient systems. And that's the silver lining that I see.
Exactly. There needs to be institutional readiness going forward to cope with the next pandemic. President Liu, let me come back to you. And let's look at Europe first before we dive into China. We all know that rising food and energy prices are bad. It causes hardship and even political unrest. We saw the example of Sri Lanka, where protesters even deposed their president. What's been done to stabilize these prices, especially in Europe? How real is the possibility that Russia may eventually cut off gas supplies to Europe? Can Europe meet the challenges? Professor Liu.
Yes. We have to learn to live to the reality, and nobody really predicted that the war in Ukraine could last so long, and there could be so tough measures that is there to escalate such sort of tension. And still, people are still in a dark tunnel. We do not know when is really the end of it and how the end could be, because people are, the Europeans are getting more prepared for the rehabilitation and reconstruction of Ukraine. But when is that going to start? The other is, pandemic people, or even 2 years ago, we thought, within 3 months it's going to be done. But now it seems there's a resurgence, the variation and the new variation, etc. And that really provokes the hike of global commodity prices, be it energy, food, and grain, etc. And just because of that, actually, that's a matter of social psychology, where people who even have more of the food and more of the energy, they would like to keep it just in case of further disaster that might encounter. So as a matter of fact, if you see the Dr. Sen, who is the Nobel laureate, he researched that during every famine, there is surplus of food in India because the rich would like to keep it more. And also, those speculators might take unfair advantage of such sort of shortfall of this type of supply. And now many of those vulnerable countries, less developed countries, or least developed countries are really crying for the basic kit for survival. It is really up to those able countries to extend their hand and do not say, okay, I'm having enough trouble, but this is the global community that everyone and every country, every responsible government and companies needs to do something to keep this world afloat.
Right. President Wuttke, I want to ask you about European politics. We've seen Boris Johnson exiting from the British prime ministership, and also there's going to be a snap election in Italy where Prime Minister Mario Draghi is going out as well. What is going to happen to European politics?
Let me come back to the first question about Europe and the war. The only solution is that the war ends. This unprovoked war has to end in order to then give more predictability. Commodity prices will remain high as long as the invasion continues. We have high energy prices, which in itself going to last for a while. The good news there is that now Europe is actually fast-tracking renewables. There will not be a going back on reliance on Russia. That might actually impact the Russian economy long-term badly. And then, of course, commodities, wheat and maize and corn. The deal has been done, and the day after, Russia has been shooting at the Odessa container harbor in order to undo this deal nearly. We need peace in that region as fast as possible. Gas has been cut off. Gas came back again at 20% of the original load. So we have a crisis in Europe in the winter, of course, and we have to toughen it out, I guess. On your question on crisis, well, Europe is not a place which is unknown to crisis. As our founding father for a European Union, Jean Monnet, once said, Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of all the solutions adopted for these crises. Again, the departure of the populist Boris Johnson is not anything that we haven't seen before. Of course, the loss of Mario Draghi is tremendous because Italy has a big high debt burden. So, but we have to live with this. We have gone through worse things. Europe has a very good comeback gene.
All right. Let's hope that is the case. Europe having a great comeback gene. Well put. Andy, let me go to you. With all the changes in Europe taking place, especially the anti-China sentiments that have been growing, whichever poll that you're looking at, where do you see Europe's relations with China heading in trade as well as in diplomacy?
Well, I think this is a very, very important question, Wang Guan. So we see, of course, that there is this global triangle, essentially, between China, the EU, and the United States. Clearly, I think it's in the interest of Europe to perhaps be less dogmatic in terms of adhering to its values, especially where those values involve imposing values on how other countries should conduct their affairs. And in this way, I think there are certainly very pragmatic voices in Europe. Certainly, historically, Germany, I think, has had a much more pragmatic and nuanced view towards China. And certainly for China, the message has been consistent throughout the years, that it's about mutual respect, it's about an open door for dialogue, and it's really about creating a shared future, not shared values, especially those values that one might feel obliged to impose on others. There's another very important piece of this, too, when we think about Europe, and this is from a military perspective when we look at NATO. So, of course, NATO's new concept now that includes China is very worrying. And we look at the evolution of NATO going from a regional defensive alliance to a regional offensive alliance to a global offensive alliance with actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now potentially involving Asia Pacific. So this is, I think, a very undesirable trend. But again, these do not happen in a vacuum. It is a triangle of the United States, the EU, and China working things out. And again, I hope that cooler heads prevail in all three countries, or certainly the US and the voices in the EU that are more confrontational towards China, and that really learning to live together is really, really important. And I do hope that that is what will prevail with EU-China relations.
Right. Some of the postures adopted by NATO did get many people in Beijing nervous. Professor Liu, I want to ask you about the Chinese economy. The target set out by the Chinese government earlier this year was for the country's GDP to grow 5.5% year on year. And now the IMF estimates there's only going to be a 3.3% growth for China. I mean, how important is it for China to meet this target? Is GDP everything once again?
Well, we still maintain a footprint and legacy of the planned economy, and which is really very helpful, at least to charter the grand goal of every 5 years and to be interpreted on a yearly basis. So therefore, the annual growth target is one that is there to guide the different local governments and also the blueprint of industrial maps, etc. And actually, this is not as mandatory as before, and it's more serving as a guideline. And there could be some surprises because the composition of GDP growth is there, government expenditure, consumer spending, exports, and capital investment, etc. So it is not really the 5.5 that really matters. It is really the quality of growth. And for example, China is now very resolved, but still in a vulnerable position for a hefty transformation from labor intensity, energy intensity into more of a high-end service sector. And China spends huge amount of money. We are talking about 1.4 trillion US dollars, to develop chips, etc. So that's going to be very costly, and given the blockade from the United States, and so there is also some sort of emotional element into it. And also now China does not really rely on the real estate development for the major growth driver, and the government is spending more of the money on social infrastructures, and particularly now the roads and ports, etc. And this is good over a long term, but whether the return on the investment can really boost the participation of those private investors, so that also requires a further consideration. But lastly, I think the more important is that how we deal with the COVID. It is really the uncertainty provoked by possible further lockdown in selected areas, particularly in key areas like what we did in Shanghai. That's something that's going to create a huge hurdle in the calculation of businesses and also even business partners like companies represented by Dr. Wuttke.
Right, many economists would agree with you, I guess. How the growth number is achieved is just as important, if not more so, than the growth number itself. President Wuttke, I want to ask you about a recent speech given by the Chinese premier at a World Economic Forum event where Premier Li said that China will deepen high-level opening up and foster a market-oriented, world-class business environment. Actually, you were there at a CCPIT event. I was there too. and you've made a request list to the Chinese premier about the things that the EU chamber hope the Chinese government can deliver. How did they go?
Let me first, unfortunately, disagree with my friend Andy. NATO is not offensive. Of course, it's defensive. The Iraq war was clearly not a NATO action. France and Germany opted out of it. Chirac and Schröder says, no way, we're going to join. And Afghanistan was international United Nations actions, including China. Well, the meeting with the Prime Minister May was fantastic. He was really giving us a non-fluffy, non-political speech, business, and gave us a mechanism that actually 5 days later was implemented by CCPIT and disseminated across China. So if we had problems, all of a sudden we had a real game changer in the kind of responsiveness of the Chinese government. And again, my speech was all about COVID. COVID has been basically overcome in the rest of the world. Basically, everyone has COVID. And we have a resumption of normal, with the notable exception of China, of course. We're here in a whack-a-mole mode where we can see that any city can go down anytime, and then it causes this uncertainty that my friend Baocheng was talking about. We have to overcome this, and primarily, and that's where the Prime Minister agreed, was vaccination, vaccination, and vaccination again. China had been under-vaccinated, so I saw with great pleasure recently that not only the leadership has indicated they were fully vaccinated, setting an example, but also vaccination rates has gone up. Now that might take a while, 6 months to 1 year, in order to get us where we want to be, meaning opening up China again. We actually don't know where the economy is going to head. Again, the uncertainty is huge. 3% is, I guess, manageable. 5.5 is out, somewhere in between. We're going to enter, and we need China to succeed in the vaccination mode, because China was basically the driver of the global economy over the last 2 or 3 years.
Well, Andy, do you want to respond?
Well, I take Joerg's point, and I think reasonable people can disagree here about NATO's actions, NATO's words, and what seems to be the future direction of NATO. And maybe I'll leave it at that. I have enormous respect for Joerg, but of course, reasonable people can disagree.
Of course, we all can agree to disagree on some issues, especially when it comes to geopolitics. We're actually focusing on the IMF report today. Andy, let me ask you about the U.S. economy, because the IMF has underlined the two factors critical to global trade, and one of them is the appreciation of the U.S. dollar, which of course means other countries will have to pay more for most of the items that they import. How big a risk is it?
Well, I think it certainly is an important risk, Wang Guan. As you said, some key commodities, oil, of course, I think is one of the most important, if not the most important, that is denominated in dollars. So that, in addition to the other factors that we touched on, some of the geopolitical considerations, the structural design of oil production globally, so we can see this is clearly a problem. A higher U.S. dollar, of course, can be good for Americans, gives them greater purchasing power on purchasing imported goods. But of course, it's bad for people that want to buy other products as well. So I think this is a concern. Related to this, we need to look at why is the dollar becoming stronger. And of course, this is besides questions of NATO, are perhaps very also controversial topics as well. But certainly one factor is relative interest rates or interest rate differentials. And as the U.S. raises interest rates, of course, it becomes more attractive for all kinds of investors to want to shift into dollar-denominated holdings. And this, of course, runs contrary to what I was saying earlier, that we may be looking at a sovereign debt crisis for the United States. One, I think, very painful lesson some investors have learned is never bet against the Fed. You might be right in theory or even in logic, but given the bazooka or the bazookas that the Fed is able to deploy, very hard to say. So I think that, Wang Guan, a stronger dollar is a double-edged sword, but certainly imposes costs around the world and could be politically destabilizing as well for countries that are needing access to dollars.
Right, talking about risks, another one is the outflow of capital. Professor Liu Baocheng, let me ask you, investors' appetite for risk is decreasing, obviously, and they're likely to pull out of emerging economies to look for safer havens. And during such times, the U.S. Treasury becomes a primary choice for investors. How do you see the future of global investment, at least in the short run?
Well, we normally distinguish between hot money and cool money. Hot money are there to be very speculative. They are more risk adaptive, and they go hit and run. So for volatile economies, and this is really the favorite for the hot money. But cooler money will go for longer term investment. So it's not only there to gamble on certain funds and or on short term liquidity issue, but they really go even with the green development for new businesses, etc. So right now, it is really the confidence that investors can really receive from different sovereignties, different governments, and there are countries that offer far higher interest rates, but they are not really there to be attractive given the risk calculation, also given the uncertain return on their investment. So therefore, the United States, is always there to bear the blame, whatever they do, and so. But I think this is really a good move that's there to cool down the possible rise of inflation. And Andy is talking about a bazooka, but I think it's more of a boomerang. And Fed has been playing, and it has been rather successful actually to give a strong signal and to cool down the global commodity prices and also direct those investments towards the more of a long-term and high-quality growth, and that could be really the result could really be shared by the world. And even though a lot more people blame that the U.S. is getting more and more protective by itself.
Okay, finally, we have 1 minute left. President Wuttke, the transition to green, clean energy seems to have been hit by the fuel crisis. Do you see that happening?
Yes, of course, it is happening, but possibly too late. I mean, we have been warned for decades, and now it happens much faster than we thought. Renewables are, of course, but of course, we have sinners. The European Union has been sinning with more coal because of the inability of having enough gas, as well as China, because of the energy crisis last year, has been kickstarting again coal production. We have to grow out of this, and we have to grow out of this very, very fast. In particular, as the economy is slowing down, let me just end here by saying that, the era of cheap finance is over. We have to get used to the fact that debt burdens are going to boomerang much faster. Hyper-globalization is over. Geopolitics is, as my friends Baocheng and Andy said, around the corner. And that's going to hit emerging markets, definitely. But let me end on a positive note. Global cooperation is needed. WTO actually is not dead. Moscow Minister Wang Guan was there, which is wonderful, one of the first ministers to travel. So really hope that G20 in end of November sees President Xi participating.
Alrighty, thanks so much, President Wuttke, Andy, Professor Liu. Thank you all very much, gentlemen. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.